Good morning, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming this morning for what promises to be a really interesting and challenging day. And to begin with, I just would like to introduce the new president of RIT Kosovo, Dr. Sharon Hart. Please, thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Rochester Institute of Technology, Kosovo, previously known as, for many of you, the American University of Kosovo, we welcome all of you to the campus here today. This is definitely an exciting time for us because this is once in a great time, great opportunity to bring together so many key individuals, not only here locally, but across the globe, who've been able to come in here and participate in this very, very important topic towards sustainable governance here in Kosovo. So this is also an opportunity for, we have many students who are also here with us, who have also traveled, many of them from afar, many of them from the United States and beyond, to participate in our summer program. And this is one of the highlights, and really a first, I believe, that we are offering here at the university. So again, we want to thank our students as well for being here today. If I can take just a moment, I would like to recognize some key individuals who really have worked behind the scenes to prepare for this activity. I'd like to, again, if I could, Mark, if you would please stand to be recognized. Mialma, where is Mialma? Mialma is downstairs. So my office is also working very, very hard on this project. We have, where's Dan? Right here, we've got our Chief Academic Officer, Dan Costantino, who, again, has been with the institution for a number of years. I don't want to forget a lot of other folks. Visar, we've got Visar in the back over here. Others from the management team, anyone else from the management team who's here this morning I've not recognized yet? Okay. Please stand. Ela, please stand to be recognized if you would. Thank you. And then if I could, I would like to have all of the students who are here, all the students stand to be recognized at this point. All students. Okay, folks, these are our future worldwide leaders, right, everyone? Future worldwide leaders, no matter where they are from. We're looking forward to their exciting futures. Again, and let me just ask, are there any other faculty and employees, other individuals from the institution? Please stand. Mark, you can stand again. We've got other faculty who are here in the summer program, back in the summer program as well. Thank you for being here. Again, this is excellent. Again, and also for many of our special and invited guests today, we really hope that you will find this to be a wonderful experience. We're looking forward to hearing from many of our special guests who are participating today on panels and/or as individual speakers. This is a great opportunity to bring together, like I say, many fine and wonderful individuals that can truly help to identify many of these, like I say, special areas around this topic that can really look towards the future of this great country and how we can be sustaining the governance here in the long run. So I'm not the one that's up here speaking today. I just want to be here to welcome you. Thank you for participating. We look forward to a great day, and I look forward to seeing many of you around campus today and for students beyond today. So thank you all. Have a great session. Thank you.
So again, thank you again for coming, and it's a great honor. I won't say too much because the person I'm about to introduce is very well known in Kosovo. He is somebody who has been active in creating what is arguably the best publication in Kosovo. He was fighting for Kosovo long before the fall of Yugoslavia, and he is today with us. He is a publicist. He was at Rambouillet. He is one of the people, when you think of the leading figures, intellectuals, public figures in Kosovo, we always think of Veton Surroi. So I would just like to introduce my friend Veton Surroi, who I've known many years.
Thank you, Mark. Madam President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's a pleasure for me to be here. As a writer and somebody who is involved now in writing novels, I'm afraid my language will not be entirely politically correct, but I suppose I was invited exactly for that purpose. Jorge Luis Borges, the famous Argentine writer, said in an interview in the Paris Review in the late 50s of the last century that he writes because he is unhappy. Happiness, says he, is a point which moves you to do nothing except enjoy it. You enjoy happiness. If we invite Borges into our debate today, it is for an easy conclusion. We are discussing among ourselves on how to get sustainable governance in Borges's unhappiness, for the simple reason of not having seen such a governance in all these past years, in the transition towards freedom and statehood. In his analogy, we wouldn't be discussing sustainable governance if we were happy. If we had such a governance, we would be rather enjoying it instead of talking about it. The ramifications of this analogy, beyond the probably comical equation between happiness and sustainable governance, I'm quite sure sustainable governance is not very high on the individual's list of happiness, would conduce us logically to describe Kosovo as an entity that has had, depending on the point of view, over a considerable period of time, a lack of sustainable governance, insufficiency of it, or a lack of governance altogether. Whatever the nuance, the negation of state governance is of utmost importance to understand the past almost 2 decades now. And to further our understanding, let us use an illustration that could be literary if it were not true. On March 24th, 1998, our then leader, later President Dr. Rugova, went to his usual weekly press conference to tell the people of Kosovo 3 things. First, the Kosovo presidential and parliamentary elections held 2 days ago went well. He was elected president, and the parliament would convene as soon as possible, which is something that he said from 1990 onward. 2, the Serbian regime has continued its policy of massacres. He illustrated this with one in Lojan, and he condemned this and asked to stop. And 3, the Republic of Kosovo had just been recognized by the Dominion of Melchizedek. He had in his hands the fax message saying so. Journalists asked many questions on that press conference about the post-elections and the Serbian violence, and at the end was one question on the recognition by the Dominion with a complicated name which nobody remembered. What will be the next step? Asked the journalist, and Dr. Rugova, in a tone that was supposed to state the obvious, said, we will establish diplomatic relations with them and exchange ambassadors. Now, Kosovo, at the moment of Rugova's press conference, was heavily occupied by Serbia. Its police and military controlled life in the territory, and it would be fairly difficult to imagine how we could establish diplomatic relations with another country. Furthermore, it would be even more difficult since the Dominion of Melchizedek, unknown in geography, became known only to law enforcement agencies in the US and France after President Chirac received a declaration of war from the Dominion on his fax machine. As a group of fraudsters who, among other things, sold Dominion passports to Filipinos and others wanting to emigrate, and painted a racing horse white in order to cheat in horse races in Australia. Nevertheless, there was a continuous collective belief, not only in Rugova, but also in the eventuality that press conferences after press conferences, Kosovo would be an independent country, establishing diplomatic relations first with the dominions of this world and then with other countries, of which the main was the United States of America. And this, despite suffering the obvious consequences of the Serbian brutal occupation. This is a classic case of cognitive dissonance, in which two parallel cognitions clash. On the one hand, Kosovo being occupied, subjected to heavy repression, and on the other, establishing diplomatic relations as an independent country. On one hand, being subjected to Serbian state terror, and on the other, believing that after every Friday's press conference, Kosovo was liberated. The author of the concept cognitive dissonance, the American social psychologist Leon Festinger, published a book together with two other authors in 1957. It was titled When Prophecy Fails. There's a worthy analysis there for the Kosovars also to see how deeply they were involved in prophetic beliefs. But for this occasion, I will stress only 2 points. One, the end of dissonance in prophecies is both necessary and brutal for the believers, and it was so for Kosovars. It was brutal in finding out that the last option for liberation is war, with its terrible price in lives and property. It was necessary to end the dissonance because it is the way out, the way to create a consonance of beliefs and realities. And two, the new consonance of beliefs ultimately did not happen by internal action only, but by outside force. Kosovars could have spent many more years reaching a unified point of beliefs that a liberation war was the solution, but the liberation was possible only by a NATO intervention that did not have liberation of Kosovo as its proclaimed war aim. Let's apply now the Melchizedek lessons to the initial Borges aim of this conference. First, we are here to discuss governance in Kosovo because there's a dramatic lack of it. The lack of governance is a product of cognitive dissonance. As a society, our public discourse contains exactly the right things that the West wants to hear. Kosovo is a democracy with a functioning economy. It should be in the EU, NATO, at peace with its neighbors, etc. But the state is described either as partially authoritarian, a hybrid state of formal democracy, or as a captured state, a state ruled not by the law, but by an organized crime group and its capacity to control the institutions of the state. For the past 17 years, Kosovars and the international community involved have believed that if they do what they have been doing, the result will somehow come out of itself, and Kosovo will become a European functioning democracy. At the same time, Kosovo is consistently behaving in a way to prove that it is not a European functioning democracy. Second point, it is a basic conclusion that, as in the case of liberation of Kosovo, nothing happens or can be achieved without external action. And since 1999, there was a continuous external action in Kosovo, from UNMIK to ULEX, to day-to-day macromanagement from embassies, or rather said, from the embassy. Then the question arises of what is the quality and direction of the external action. There's a need, therefore, to reduce the dissonance between the two beliefs, that Kosovo, with the international community's help, is or has become a democracy en route to the EU, and the reality of a territory without sustainable governance, in fact, a captured state. Leon Festinger wrote that dissonance reduction can be achieved by changing behavior, by changing cognition, or selectively acquiring new information or opinions. He gave the example of a smoker who has knowledge that smoking is bad for his health. He may reduce dissonance by choosing to quit smoking, by changing his thoughts about the effects of smoking. For example, smoking is not so bad for your health as others claim. Or by acquiring knowledge pointing to the positive effects of smoking. For example, smoking prevents weight gain, and therefore you continue. Kosovo has, in the past 7 years, used number 2 and 3. It has continued smoking because it has been changing its thoughts about it, or acquired new knowledge about it. As in smoking is not as bad as others claim, it has been said that Kosovo may have moved slowly. It is criminalized, dysfunctional, has the largest unemployment in Europe, but it is more or less going in the right direction. Or, as in smoking that prevents weight gain, if things in Kosovo had not been done the way they were done since liberation, the situation would have been much worse. What is evident, actually, is that we need to get to number 1, and that is stop smoking altogether. What is a cold turkey therapy for Kosovo? Recognizing the brutality of the realities. As in 1998, when we could not be an occupied territory and simultaneously an independent country, we need to discard the notions of normalcy that are so dissonant with our lives. The first and foremost assessment is that Kosovo is an incomplete state. It is incomplete in its capacity to administer its territory. The Kosovo authorities have shared for the past 17 years this territory with the authorities of Serbia, and they still do. It is incomplete in its European and international identity and legitimacy. It is unrecognized by 5 members of the EU, and it is not a member of the UN. It has still the need, or others believe so, for quasi-colonial caretaking in rule of law, be it in ULEX or with a special court. These are all, if you will, hardware problems in computer language. And without a solution to them, it is hardly imaginable discussing sustainable governance. That would be the software type of language we would be discussing. These hardware problems have been further aggravated by the half-baked attempt to find a solution to them. Since 2010, the European Union has mediated the so-called Brussels process of negotiations between Kosovo and Serbia, in which the Kosovo representatives accepted as their own the Serbian position that the status of Kosovo is still in dispute, and that as part of resolving that dispute, Kosovo would create an ethnically based territorial autonomy for the Kosovo Serbs. So, number 1 problem is being defined at all as a state. And as always, a problem that quickly gets more attention than the ones of governance, corruption, public services. As long as the question of status is open, there's a natural tendency of public opinion to move in that direction. Number 2, the character of the state. In the Cold War years, Samuel Huntington, in Political Order and Changing Societies, started off by making a basic distinction between governed and ungoverned countries. and by concluding that there's far less difference between the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union, which were governed, despite their ideological differences, than there is with countries in the developing world that may be nominally democracies, but have lack of governance. Kosovo is geographically a European country, but the measuring stick for it is not its capacity to integrate into the EU. The measuring stick for its statehood is its capacity to move out of the third world. Despite being in Europe, Kosovo's unemployment is higher than that of Palestine, a non-country. Actually, Kosovo has an equal or higher unemployment than the Gaza Strip, 41.6%, according to the Palestine Central Bureau of Statistics. The West Bank in Palestine is at 16.3%, a European country compared to Kosovo. Kosovo's priorities in economic decision-making are closer to the third world jokes. Since independence, the bulk of investment of public resources has gone to the highway to the Albanian border, and now to the Macedonian border. Almost €1 billion have been paid for the highway to the Albanian border. That money has made it possible that a truck full of bell peppers from Rahovec or scrap metal from Perizaj, which are our traditional exports, arrived half an hour earlier to the Albanian port of Durrës. Something that the bell peppers and scrap metal could actually do without. Understandably, the highway did not change the way business is conducted, nor has changed the economic structure of this country. Kosovo has not increased its employment or exports with the highway. So then why such a decision? As in the old third world jokes, the questions lie in the money spent on asphalt. A kilometer of highway in Denmark, of a similar or same highway in Denmark, costs 6.7 million euros. In Croatia, it costs 7.3 million euros. In Kosovo, it went to 11 million euros per kilometer. Now, if the government was acting irresponsibly, and they have convinced us so, should the chaperones of our independence have said something about it? Well, one of the main supporters, and lobbyists would probably be a more appropriate word, of the highway, or for this highway, and the way it was contracted, and the way it was not disclosed to the public, and the contract is still secret, by the way, although the money was public, was the US ambassador to Kosovo. After the end of his mandate, the ambassador became an employee of the American construction giant Veton, which had received the contract in Kosovo. His present job is in sub-equatorial Africa, in Mozambique, which, other than to illustrate the natural sequencing of third world cliches, serves to introduce Professor Christopher Platten from SOAS in London, who analyzed the nature of post-colonial states in Africa, and wrote quite many books about it, including The Nature of the Third World. He took a longer look at the moment when the colonial flag goes down and the new state goes up. The moment when the state institutions left by the old masters, together with whatever resources are up for grabs for the new government. He called it neo-patrimonialism. That is a form of organization in which relationships of a broadly patrimonial type pervade the political and administrative system, which is formally constructed on rational legal lines. Now, it is a system in which an office of power is used for personal uses and gains, as opposed to a strict division of the private and public spheres. And I think we who live in Kosovo know quite a lot about this. Kosovo did not have that midnight moment when the old flag goes down and the other goes up. It was actually much more chaotic than that, and indeed there is still a UN flag around here to remind us that the story is not over. But then the narrative of institutions was up for grabs is all too familiar. It started actually by kicking out Serbs and Roma. And any Serb and Roma would do, without discrimination. And taking initially or buying out later the property under violent conditions. It continued with killing Albanians, who happened to be of a different political opinion. From the 14th of June of 1999 until the 31st of December of 1999, an average of 6 persons was killed every single day. One was Roma, identified by his skin. The other was an Albanian, identified by his political beliefs. The 4 others were Serbs, identified by their language, altogether a sign of otherness from the killers. This wave continued with occupying any segment of public sphere, from names of streets to the members of the faculty in the university. Anything that was public was fair game for occupation. These first months of a liberated Kosovo were important because they would show the way forward. And the way forward was state capture, by physically occupying the public space left behind by the departed occupying authorities, and impossible to be filled by the UN mission. State capture meant taking over nascent institutions, the public broadcaster, for example, customs service, or the police, or the constitutional court, or at the end, taking it all with massive electoral fraud. In this process, one group, political group, in particular with its leader, the president of Kosovo, Hashim Thaçi, were identified as the ones to have led it, profited from, and defined Kosovo with. In the analysis of the special prosecutor of what's going to be the special court for Kosovo, based on the Marti report, there is evidence to take to court an organized group of people led by Mr. Thaçi for the continuous criminal activity that has led to state capture. State capture is probably the most extraordinary and visible form of what Francis Fukuyama, using Weber's definitions, would describe as patrimonial state. With a political recruitment based on the principles of kin selection, all members of political clan that may also be territorial, and reciprocal altruism. You are selected to do something for me because I will reward you or have rewarded you for it. Thaçi's Kosovo is a model of a pre-modern state. His political, regional, and family clan, among other things, have or do successfully control petrol stations, the way public money is spent without bidding procedures, the public university, the utilities, PTK and KEK, police, courts, public television, and a number of non-publicly owned media, a parallel secret service called SHIP, the privatization agency, the ability of private companies to independently operate. You can make a profit if you are close to the authorities and share it with them, vice versa. If you don't, you will not be able to sustain your independence. The constitutional court, the culture of impunity. You can get away with whatever you do as a mayor, MP, or minister of government if you are part of the clan. And last but not least, a very low level of use of the Albanian language. And there lies the challenge, how to move to modern statehood. Therefore, to sustainable governance. How to make Kosovo's governance impersonal, one that does not favor close to kin family or political family or clan or criminal gang, and the lines between these categories may be significantly blurred. In Fukuyama's analysis from his 2 books on political order, modern democratic statehood needs the three pillars: state institutions, that is state building, rule of law, and accountability. Now, state building has been endangered from the beginning, as we saw, by state capture from the inside and a very meticulous policy of disputing its possibility as a state altogether by a policy conducted by Serbia, and not only diplomatically, but also with other means, and in wider geopolitics by Russia. Rule of law has not been strengthened. It spent years in the vacillation of what would be the laws. Are they of UNMIK? Are they ex-Yugoslavia? Is the new Kosovo? We spent many years in a legal vacuum gap. Police and the courts have been under intense pressure by the forces of state capture. UN and later ULEX have proven not to be a match for the challenges from organized crime and their political mentors, or at least not yet. Accountability, as in parliament oversight, has been a joke. In a patrimonial state, the parliament is part of the planned divisions. Furthermore, the patrimonial state has been controlling the public broadcasting and successfully corrupting a good part of the civil society scene. To aggravate the challenges, the Brussels dialogue has the potential to further disrupt the system by introducing a new legal and non-constitutional category of territorial autonomy, while at the same time not bringing to closure the relationship of Serbia and Kosovo. The situation is hopeless. So many factors in state capture that will prevent moving from one issue to the other. It may look so. And there is no prescription of sequencing. Time will not stop so that in an enlightened community, somebody establishes impersonal institutions. Or that everything waits out till Kosovo becomes a UN member. Or that we have credible institutions of rule of law, or those of democratic oversight. To make matters worse, it is not that the international environment is an inspiring and conducive one. This is not the Europe of 1989, when as a 28-year-old, I got engaged in the leadership of a nonviolent movement for democracy and freedom. This is the Europe of Brexit, of illiberal democracy in Hungary, of political Islam getting into the bowels of our society. It is the world of the authoritarians like Putin and Erdogan. It is the world in which a considerable part of America thinks it should elect as its president a bigot, populist, or charlatan, whatever description, if not all, fit Mr. Trump. Rationally, the chances are not very big for Kosovo to make this significant step forward. There is not a critical mass that will move it in that direction. The supposed enlightened debate in the society is hiding in the comfort of Facebook. The initial stage of change may be in the external action. Kosovo needs proof that there is a possibility for the rule of law, and if the special court becomes a serious institution with a credible procedure, it can show, in Fukuyama's words, that the rule of law limits the power of government by establishing accepted rules of justice which are higher than any individual who currently holds political power. The special court can show this if it can deal with the criminal proceedings of state capture at the highest levels. And ULEX, with its new breath of life, can try to do the same thing now from the inside. But although a big chance, even if this is realized, it will not be sufficient. Actually, it will not be conducive unless there is leadership within our society that will create and demonstrate in practice a platform of moving from an extractive state, that is a state that serves politicians and their environment, to an inclusive state, the statehood that cares for the needs of its citizens. And here we, although being in the third world, and as a third world country, need to return to an ethos demonstrated before. In 1989 and 1990, despite all forces to the contrary, we developed a policy of integrating into the movement of European democracies. And despite what is happening today in Europe and beyond, Kosovo actually still needs the model of a European functioning democracy for its own sake. It needs it in order to bring about the respect for public institutions as a European category, be they in health, education, or administration. It needs it in order to mimic the procedures of respect for public money and to consider the normalcy of rule of law. The European agenda of Kosovo should not be one of many irresponsible promises of visa liberalization, and therefore a prospect of becoming a European by voting with our feet. The European agenda of Kosovo should actually be the model of statehood, if not the model of achieving Denmark, as has become popular to say in political sciences, trying to imitate what can be imitated. In the end, Kosovo has actually no existential choice but to move ahead. A stagnant society such as ours has already become a target for political Islam, directed against our ethnic and political identity. A stagnant society such as ours has become part of the Russian games for many years now. The Mitrovica Bridge is actually the division line between the Western and the Russian influences in Europe. And a stagnant society such as ours has, with the help of the international community, tested much more illiberal democracy than our poor pockets can afford. Kosovo then simply doesn't have the money to pay for state capture anymore. It needs that kind of governance of which we were talking about. Thank you.
You've given us a nice bath of cold water, which is really a good thing to do. Extraordinarily healthy, something that you have been doing for 30-some years at this point. And so let me say that if you would, it would be great if you could answer some questions, especially from our students and from many others who may be motivated. So,
first of all, thank you for your lecture. And I had a question when you mentioned, and I think that as we all are hoping in special court and ULEX, but can we really trust them since we just had some of the affairs from the ULEX about corruption and everything. So is it Kosovo who corrupts people, or just people who come here are all corrupted?
No, I don't think people who come here are corrupted. And in fact, I don't think people are born corrupt or born crooked, or a particular geography makes them crooked. And this reminds me of a question that I was asked at Heart Talk at the BBC, in which Tim Sebastian at the time, when he was conducting, said, and how can you know, we liberated you, and look what you are doing, you've created a total mess, you're a criminal place, you kill people, etc., etc., and the "you" was directed to me. And then I said, well, you know, imagine if your country spent not 6 months, but 6 days without police, without courts, without laws, and after a violent conflict, you know, all those nice Londoners who go around would be killing each other, but they usually do when they get drunk, but they would be doing it gratis. These people, you know, a society that has not been run by law, even one with such a long tradition as the British, would descend into chaos. And so the importance of institutions is foremost. The second thing, do we have to trust, or can we trust, or can we believe in ULEX and the special court? By nature, we have to distrust institutions. That's the healthy part of democracy. They have to be accountable somehow, and they have to demonstrate that they can deliver. ULEX has demonstrated so far that it can deliver very slowly, or it cannot deliver at all in some cases. They have, as I said, a new breath of life of 2 years. The special court, we don't know yet, but we cannot, I think the healthier part would be not to trust them too much, not to distrust them at all. They need to have a chance. The sad part of it, whenever it's established and whenever it starts functioning, is that it speaks badly about our society, because our society has needed a special court to deal with issues that another special court, the ULEX, had left behind, which had not been dealt with another special institution, which was the UN law enforcement agencies. So we've gone from one special case to the other, and hopefully this will be the end of it.
Hans, Joachim.
We'd like to thank you very much for your speech, and it's the second time I had the honor and the pleasure, and you have a lot of sympathizers and friends, for example, inside the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, for example. Best regards. What for me was quite interesting, I was 2 years ago here, and there was a kind of, constitutional crisis. And it was for me as a foreigner quite interesting to see it brought in again, a judge from the United States. And unfortunately, he got quoted with the following words: I had to come back in order to create and to put order into the Constitutional Court here. And unfortunately, there was an article written about it, and it was said, yes, it was not so difficult to convince him because his salary got raised. That's one of the points. The other is what you said, patrimony. And what you said, and that it goes far deeper, let's say you need a society, how do you say, living up to certain challenges, what we call to create a robust, vibrant civil society in order to work on what happened in the past. And as a German, let's say it took us a long time to look back and to work on our past, particularly as far as the judicial system is concerned. It took us a long time to deal with what happened in the past. And you know, because you know our country quite well, how difficult it was for certain people to sue certain criminals, having assumed high responsibilities in our country. For example, the closest advisor of our Chancellor was the one who drafted the racial laws during the Third Reich. ULEX, for me, because he asked the question, who comes over here to Kosovo? I'm not an expert as far as selecting personnel. Who speaks the language? Who knows your culture? And I went back to differ and say, of course, there's a danger of corruption.
Absolutely, there's a danger for corruption, but it goes with the profession. But when you spoke about the Constitutional Court, now, and I want to use this into showing that there's not a there's not a model for getting out of this situation, but it has to be a custom fit. The ex-president of the Constitutional Court is now in court himself for criminal proceedings because he's been accused of falsifying the vote of the Constitutional Court. The American judge, Mr. Carolyn, had excluded himself from the proceedings on conflict of interest basis. In the vote, as signed by Mr. Hassani, it appears that Mr. Carolyn had voted. And so court here in Kosovo has to conclude whether or not that was there was a falsifying of his presence. If that were the case, then a very big legal issue emerges, and that is because the vote was instrumental in actually keeping the constitutional court functioning. Do the decisions made by the constitutional court, one that has been kept by falsifying, are they actually valid? Or is there a need to review the court's decision? And if you enter in reviewing the court's decisions, and this is one of the funniest constitutional courts in probably in legal history, at one point it dealt whether a Volkswagen Kombi could drive on the right side or not of the highway. And this was a way to prevent one high PDK official from going to jail, was to actually analyze whether when you drive on a highway and the guy who drives a Volkswagen Kombi on the right side, whether he was driving 60 kilometers instead of 50 was a good enough reason for him to actually cause this accident. You know, constitutional courts never actually deal with traffic accidents as far as I know, but this one has been doing it. It just shows the depth of the problems that we find in this legal entity.
Hi, thank you. A very unhappy analysis. But I'd like to ask a question on behalf of the students. Because the talk was short on remedy. What should be done, what are you able to do to create this critical mass that you say is missing? Who's responsible for making that happen? What should they be doing as the next generation to create that critical mass?
Well, in the 80s, and not very publicly because of the repression, but in the mid-80s, this is what we were discussing. We were saying, you know, can we tolerate this? Can we go on tolerating the Milosevic regime? Can we continue like this? And you know, it has to be that individual, and it has to be that individual who has to lead. And suddenly you had people who spoke more publicly, who emerged, who developed some kind of leadership. Dr. Surroi was not a very well-known person, except for literary criticism, but he suddenly started talking, and then people started talking with him, and that's how things created Mshketin Madici and other people. And so what I think should be happening now is a debate coming from a generation of people who have gone through it now, who have gone through this transition, don't like it, and have the energy to fight for change. And it's not easy. It's more difficult than one could imagine. That's on the internal side. But as I say, there needs to be an external action. If you have promise after promise, you know, ULEX was, we were involved in the negotiations, I was involved in the Vienna negotiations. The final draft of Ahtisari's package said we would get around 200 people on the rule of law side, of which, if I remember well, 120 would be domestic staff, secretaries, assistants, etc., drivers, and 80 people would be ones who would be overlooking the legal system here. When Ahtisari went to Brussels, Brussels said, no. Kosovo is not actually ready for its own rule of law. We will send a robust rule of law mission of 2,000 people. And for people like me, although I don't like that quasi-colonial attitude, I would have much preferred that our own forces emerge in legality. At some point, I saw that many people were happy about it. You know, said, they were imagining court procedures by some strong American judge who would come here and put 10 corrupt politicians in jail, and then 20 more crooks, and the other guy who killed the other guy who never went to jail, he should go to jail as well. So there was a general emotion, a collective belief, a Melchizedek, if you will, that someday ULEX will come and clean the house, and then we get a clean house so we can run it. This doesn't happen. And if the special court repeats the same thing, it will basically limit the chances for emergence of political activism.
Are there other questions? Please. Who else?
Hello. For those of you that do not know me, I'm Shukriya Gaushi, Executive Director of Prominent Kosovo Center for Conflict Management, teaching at summer program up, and also many years human rights activist. Thank you very much for your amazing speech, reflecting on some really crucial point of views that made things worsening in Kosovo. My question would be like, do you think we have potential capacity, local and international, and also the courage to make sustainable changes in Kosovo in order to build some kind of counter-narrative for the captured state in Kosovo? Thank you.
In terms of human capital, we have never been better. In terms of human capital, we have many more educated people than we have had any time before. In terms of human capital, we have more experience than any time before. So if this is true, why don't we have more change? And the first question is because state capture means also capturing part of that capital. A patrimonial state creates conditions for inclusion of that kind of segment of the society. A patrimonial state also means that if you are young, educated, bright, well-meaning, but you are part of the patrimonial state, you have an allegiance to that state. So you have an allegiance to your clan leader, or gang leader, or whatever he is, until conditions ripen for change. Now the question is, why are people who are not in the patrimonial state involved in changing it? And the answer is because, to an extent, the idea of the patrimonial state is not only the PDKs. If you remember well, in the first government, the first multi-party government in Kosovo had a distribution between the LDK, the PDK, and the A.U.K. And at 4 p.m. you had this big traffic jam in Pristina because all of these guys brought people in from their municipalities, the A.U.K. from the Dugajin area, and the PDK from the Drinca area, and the LDK from Gjidana somewhere. So the whole state administration had to be bussed in the morning and bussed out in the afternoon because that's where their patrimony was. So there's a basic distribution, a planned regional distribution of power that has changed now. The PDK has gone beyond the inside, it's stronger in other areas as well. But so but the point is, the patrimonial state was not initially only the idea of the PDK. It was, you know, I run my organization, I'm going to have my people, I run my territory, I manage my territory, and they are going to be part of the. And if you had a careful linguist go into the government, you would understand by their regional accents actually where do they belong politically as well.
Thank you. I'm Aidan Herr from the University of Westminster. I'm teaching in the summer school as well. Yeah, really, really fascinating, and I thoroughly agreed with your analysis. You know, when you talk about state capture and patrimonial states and that kind of thing, I would agree with you that that applies in the case of Kosovo. However, when you look into the kind of history of these states, one of the major differences between those kinds of states and Kosovo, I've always felt, is that in the crucial period that you outlined, let's say from the end of NATO's intervention in 1999 to about the end of 2000, 2001, during that period, Kosovo was under extraordinarily direct international supervision. It had, you know, obviously NATO here, it had UNMIK, it latterly had EULEX, and obviously had the influence of the embassy. And yet this corruption and this violence occurred under this extraordinary international supervision. Now it suggests to me that this could not have happened had it not been for the complicity of these international actors. And rather than people from the outside saying, oh, Albanians are violent, Albanians are corrupt, which is the easy solution, people used to say that about the Irish as well, obviously, but in the case of Albania, it strikes me that that could not have happened. The situation we're in today could not have happened were it not for the fact that a number of the international agencies mandated to supervise Kosovo's transition not just failed, but were complicit in creating the state that we have today. And I would worry then, and this is kind of what I'd like you to address, I would worry that the remit of the special court that's looking into that period is going to reconfirm that narrative, that it was bad Albanians doing bad things to Serbs or Roma, and that we, the international community, you know, are aghast that this ever happened, when in actual fact there was a significant degree of complicity in this crucial period.
Yes, there are three answers to that. The first one is the Kosovo example was actually a new model. It was unprecedented. It's unprecedented to liberate a country, but the forces of liberation do not take administration. In Kosovo's case, the forces of liberation were NATO. And so what would have, in European history, been repetitive would have been for NATO to take over the administration. In the Kosovo case, it was the UN filling in and trying to create a new administration from scratch. And Jacob remembers this much better than anybody else. It was actually trying to invent something totally new from the mother of all resolutions, you know, get 1244 and then try to devise something out of it in the balance of forces with Russia, etc., etc. Overall, I think I would not fault UNMIK overall. I think especially the first wave of people that came were people who came not only seeing it as a job, but actually with a degree of passion and wanted actually to help. And you know, these were well-meaning people who came here. The problem was with the Kosovars lacking consensus and therefore not creating a body that would take this country normally into its stage of building institutions. And lacking that, UNMIK had to be the Kosovar, actually, had to supplant the Kosovar and had to name the Kosovar who's done this or that or the other. So that's one big problem. The second problem is that this all happened not in a transition of institutions. Because if this were a fall of Berlin Wall situation, you would have institutions still running the place. And then supplant, you know, you would supplant the administrators and the top managers, but basically the institutions would somehow stay and then reform itself and move. On July the 16th of 1999, I was having dinner with Jacobi and Bernard Kouchner. There was a part of Pristina that was burning. We could see it from the place where we were having dinner. And both Kushner and Kobe were agitated and wanted to go out and help, etc. And started calling telephones. And then we found out that there were two fire trucks of the British Army, and those were putting fires somewhere else. There was no civilian fire truck agency because they had left and no new had been installed. And so you have to deal with all of these situations every single day. That leaves a vacuum in governance. And in the vacuum of governance, you have then those who are more able or armed or willing or tough take that place and get into that place. And this is what happened. What the special court is probably going to do is actually make, if it goes the way you're saying, is probably actually going to give that narrative in a very simplified way, in which you have thugs who have thugs, but not without the precondition that they become thugs.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Elisa Randatson from the London School of Economics. I have a question about what seems to be quite a cautiously optimistic view of the potential for the special court, or in general for external oversight. And I'm just wondering, is it possibly the case that putting so much emphasis on oversight, or the capability for oversight, might actually make the cognitive dissonance worse, to the point that you go back to the stage right after the intervention where you can't rule yourself, but you desperately want to. And I think perhaps this might create problems in relation to where the critical mass is found. So you might have a situation where the critical mass is there, like you were saying, but the powers that be are happening on a much higher level. The conversation is happening at a much higher level, and the powers that be are basically deciding what happens to the country.
No, I think you're right. I hope I did not give that impression. You know, putting the emphasis on the special court only is like putting the emphasis on the recognition of Melchizedek. It's that kind of futile belief that somehow there will be a Deus ex machina, come here and sort things out and leave it in our hands. What I'm saying is that if there is an action by the special court, and I hope it is a serious action, then even that would be insufficient without significant change in political leadership, and not only in terms of people, but actually in terms of narrative, programs, and behavior. And I think there ought to be people who can, and I think there are people actually in our society who can do these things.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. Hi. So you said that sort of the number one problem is Kosovo being recognized as a state at all, and that's sort of jumping the gun, like problems internally need to be broken down. So all these talks about EU integration, Euro integration, along with the signing of the stabilization and agreement, do you see that as a positive or a negative, and that it's jumping the gun when the main point of it is to address internal issues moving forward?
Yeah. The problem of sequencing is there isn't a way to deal with sequencing in every crisis, and Kosovo is specific for that. But let's take the example of our last year. During this last year, Kosovo has been paralyzed by the Brussels agreements. Its politics have been paralyzed by the Brussels agreement, by the association of certain municipalities, and by the demarcation of the border with Montenegro. In a normal situation, these issues would not be of such an importance. But in our situation, it just shows that the statehood is incomplete, and that everything that deals with statehood, with its hardware problems, gains immediate attention and has the potential for mobilization. You have authentically people who believe and who go out on the streets in winter, who actually believe that the agreements are against their own interest as a state. Now, the policies, the economic policies of the governments, of all the governments, have been dramatically wrong in terms of employment. Dramatically wrong. The public money has been misspent. There has not been a demonstration on that issue. The capture of the university mobilized at most 200 people. It mobilized 200 people. But it should have mobilized thousands of people. The dramatically bad health service, the one that kills people, should mobilize tens of thousands of people in the future, but they don't. But why does an issue like statehood mobilize? Because we have gone through a century fighting for statehood. And this is not an issue that can be left at the end. It will continuously mobilize people. And that, but again, you cannot say, we will not deal with any other issue unless we finalize this issue with Brussels in the Brussels Accord. No, we ought to be doing that at the same time doing things in changing the nature of governance, economy, etc. They need to be dealt altogether. Now, the Brussels dialogue has actually helped state capture because it has identified the people who lead it from the Kosovo side as responsible vis-a-vis the irresponsible part, which are the demonstrators who have gone out. And this has been unfair. This has brought, again, one of the biggest problems of the status quo, which is a balance between the internationals and the local Kosovars not to disrupt things. As long as things are calm, the ambassador here and the other ambassadors are quite happy about it. But if you have people demonstrating for issues, then they are unhappy about it. And then initially they fault the demonstrators. Well, you know, why do you go out the streets when you should be sitting and enjoying it? So this, the question mark now is how to disrupt the calm of this, the false calm of the society, but do it in a manner of advancing and changing and reforming the society. Because reform and change are disruptions in themselves, and status quo is stagnation.
So I think that this has been an extraordinarily good conversation as a way to begin our rest of the day. We have a roundtable that follows after a coffee break, and then we have an afternoon of kind of more academic presentation where we will unpack many of the points